Hi, welcome to Week 10 U.S. History students. This is Mr. Rosenleaf coming at you. And today, as we started a new unit last week, but due to some other factors, we couldn't do a video last week. It just got to be too late in the week. I'm using the word week a lot. But it ended up not happening, so we are going to talk about imperialism today, which hopefully, if you've all been doing your assignment, you already know a fair amount about. Okay, so imperialism, as is stated in your book, is the policy of a stronger nation to dominate a weaker nation or weaker nations economically, politically, militarily, and culturally to create an empire. Europe had control over a lot of territory in places like Africa and Asia, where there weren't a lot of very rich, very powerful countries. Also in the Americas, although there was a caveat to that, and that being the Monroe Doctrine, Europe mostly stayed out of things in the Americas, but that left room for the United States to participate in this a little bit as well. So lots of reasons why imperialism happens. On the economic front, the need for raw materials, things like petroleum, rubber. Back when the United States were the United Colonies, were the 13 colonies, and they were producing, one of the big things was lumber. And so lumber from America would be taken overseas to European mills, where they would make it into usable lumber, or oftentimes the big tall trees were taken to make masts for the big European ships. Also, America was producing cotton for the British as well. So oftentimes these stronger countries need this stuff from a weaker country, from undeveloped parts of the world, and they also need markets to sell the finished goods that they create with these products. Ultimately, it can be a not very great situation for the colony, who probably does not get as much for the raw material as it costs to buy the finished good. There's also this belief amongst especially these European powers as well as America that their country, their nation, its goals, its ideas, its values were superior to that of any other nation, especially these little struggling countries, in particular if they were full of people who were frankly not white, that they needed help, that there was this idea called the white man's burden that said that as white people, and again, I'm not talking about this to be exclusionary or anything, but I'm just explaining the context of this, that for some countries the feeling was that as white people, that they obviously knew how to live and knew how to run things properly, and it was their duty to share that knowledge with these poor little brown people, essentially. By the way, White Man's Burden comes from a Rudyard Kipling poem, and if you've never heard of Rudyard Kipling, you've probably maybe seen Disney's The Lion King. And the Lion King story, the original story, was written by Rudyard Kipling. So one of the best examples of a place that was thoroughly imperialized was the continent of Africa. If you look at this map, what you'll notice is there are exactly two places on this map that are independent, that are not controlled by other countries. And this is Africa from about 1885 to 1914, right at the start of World War I. And you'll notice the two areas that are independent: Abyssinia, and then also Liberia. And the rest of the continent is controlled by other countries. The British play a huge role in this. Look from Egypt through Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, down to Rhodesia, the thing right below Rhodesia, that Bethuna land. And then, of course, the Union of South Africa, which is still part of the British Commonwealth to this day. There are several of these places that are still part of the British Commonwealth. Nigeria, Sierra Leone. Yeah, I think that's pretty well it. Oh, British Somaliland. So those were all controlled by the British. The French, their territory is more sort of put together. You have Gabon and French Equatorial Africa, French West Africa, Algeria, Morocco. But those are all sort of lumped together for the most part, bordering each other. And then Madagascar. And then the Germans still have some territory, about 3 of them, 4 of them, take that back, because there's Togo, little Togo up there, and then Cameroon, and German East Africa, and then German Southwest Africa. So those places were controlled by the British. The Portuguese, Portugal was this, little like growth onto the end of Spain, essentially. And here's Portugal. Incidentally, they also controlled a huge amount of South America. But the Portuguese, that kind of orange color there, you can see they have several territories. The Belgium's this like France's hat. And Belgium has this massive colony right in the middle of Africa called the Belgian Congo. The Spanish, even though the Spanish Empire had declined precipitously and would continue to decline, they will still have areas in Africa. Not a ton, but some. And then, of course, the independent countries. So if you just go down that key there, it shows you what countries are what. But yeah, it's really incredible to see this territory that was made up of these people that, for the most part, did not get to control their own lives at all. Yeah, so that's Africa there. And just to give you an idea of worldwide, obviously Africa is probably the greatest example of imperialism, simply because nearly every mile of it is under imperialist control. But you also have Asia, and particularly the British in Asia, with India, and the area that stays Pakistan and some of these other bordering areas. They have Australia, they have Canada, and a whole bunch of islands you don't really see. Hong Kong as well in China. And you can see the United States is starting to get on this game with the Philippines. You have obviously the French, you have the Portuguese, you have Spain. Even Japan is in on this as they control Korea, which is an overseas territory. And they will control Korea really through about World War II. The Germans, the Italians, the Netherlands, for crying out loud, Denmark. And then the gray countries are independent, though really Russia should be on this map because it is reaching out and controlling areas that were not originally part of Russia. But because it's contiguous, it's not always counted. The same with like Austria-Hungary is listed as independent, but they were very much an imperial power. They just took over their neighbors as opposed to taking over things overseas. Same with the United States, largely until we do start taking over overseas territories, small overseas territories. But oftentimes the United States is sort of exempted from the talk of imperialism because, well, it was all just manifest destiny. But I would say if you ask the Native Americans, yes, this was highly imperialist. Okay, so little things to think about, and then your first reflection question going in your reflection journal at the end of this. So I want you to think about what is imperialism, and did the United States participate in imperialism? And then your reflection question number 1, and you may want to pause this or quickly write it down so that you can put this in the reflection journal, because there'll be another one too. Why do you think, was it European nations primarily that engaged in imperialism? So think about that. Again, pause the video if you need to, or write it down so you can think about it after we're done. Okay, so let's talk about the types of imperialism. And there are really 5 types of imperialism. So you have colonies, you have protectorates, you have spheres of influence. Let's try saying that 10 times fast. Try economic imperialism, and then you have cultural imperialism. So colonies are sort of, well, we'll get into it. All right, so colonies, think about imperialism classic. This is when a country marches its army or sails its navy to another country and takes it over, marches their army right in and takes over the country. Control of one country by another, control of a weaker country by a stronger country, and the colony is then an extension of that mother country. And the best example of this in the history of the world is the British. The British Empire, at this point, the saying was that the sun never sets on the British Empire because they were so heavily involved. And you can see that England is just a very tiny part, certainly geographically. But you also have Ireland at this point. There's a bunch of places I can't see. But India was considered to be the crown jewel of the British Empire. In fact, the royalty of Britain were known as the king or the queen of Great Britain or of England, and but they were known as the emperor or empress of India, which is fascinating. Canada was part of this. But again, India was the most important part of that empire, certainly to the monarchs, if to nobody else. Canada, Australia, the West Indies, New Zealand is just a foot. Newfoundland, which apparently was not part of Canada, just a foot. Africa is just a leg, which is crazy talk because Africa is massive. Gibraltar was another part, etc., etc., etc. So from a military standpoint, for the British and some of these other countries, their militaries were vastly superior to that of these small countries that they were coming in and taking over. These countries had very little means to resist. Some of them did try, and Britain will fight things like the Boer War and things like that against the native population of some of these countries, but ultimately it will be unsuccessful. They were just better equipped than these developing nations, and these empires also required military bases. That was one of the reasons America got into this game, was they needed military bases. So the United States takes like Midway and such to provide military bases. They got involved for humanitarian reasons and for religious reasons. This white man's duty to spread Western civilization, Western law, medicine, spread Christianity to these people that had never been exposed to it, because obviously we know how to live because we are the superior group, was their feeling. Britain was the largest imperial power of the day. France, Germany, Russia were also part of this race. By the 1890s, the United States also joins in. And this is a map. This is the British Empire shown in map form. The red areas are British, and you can see just how huge and why the saying was that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Just the amount of territories that they held, even just small little islands. But again, huge, and there were military bases on so many of these that the British military was able to be involved basically anywhere and everywhere. Ooh, I think we're still rolling. For the United States, one of our first overseas, something we took to go along with one of our first overseas territories was this island. These are the Midway Islands in the middle of the Atlantic or Pacific Ocean. And we take the Midway Islands in 1867. Okay, these were the first. Because we needed refueling bases, because we were beginning to trade with Japan, with China, with places in Asia, and we needed bases to refuel our ships. And this is where those islands are. That little white dot there in the center, that is where the Midway Islands are. You may know these if you know anything about World War II. There was a very famous battle fought around these islands, the Battle of Midway, often known as the turning point of the Pacific theater of World War II. But yeah, that's where they are. If you want to go there, you probably can't unless you're a scientist or have special government approval. It is not someplace you can just go vacation. It is mainly for scientific research, and it also has a huge pile of sea garbage that they are going through and studying. But of course, one of America's later annexations, 1898, was of course the island chain of Hawaii. And actually, the United States sent sent Marines into Hawaii to depose the Queen and put in place a civilian government in 1896, 1895, somewhere in there. And then it took a couple of years for the United States to agree to annex Hawaii under the leadership of William McKinley. But yeah, Hawaii, though the United States had missionaries in Hawaii as of about 1820. So Hawaii actually starts as cultural imperialism and will eventually become a colony, then will graduate to being a state after World War II. And another example of this, of course, Alaska, which was purchased in 1860, I want to say 6, from Russia, purchased by the United States, even though the British were probably in a better position to control this area because it's not contiguous to the United States. But William Seward, the Secretary of State at the time, got to them, I guess, before the British, or offered them a better deal than the British. And Alaska becomes part of the United States. It was known as Seward's Folly for a long time because they thought that Seward was foolish for taking this piece of territory that, honestly, it was like this frozen area, what was going to be there. Well, they didn't know at the time that gold was there. So, yeah, eventually, and then later, oil. And then another example from the United States, Puerto Rico, you lovely island. Yeah, Puerto Rico, taken over after the Spanish-American War, again, 1898, and is still a United States territory to this day. It's not truly a colony, but it's not a protectorate. They have their own teams that participate in, like, the Olympics and the Pan American Games and things like that. But they are basically under the control of Congress and the president. Okay, next up on the hit parade, protectorates. So these are independent countries that have a relationship with a more dominant power that controls their foreign policy, makes their decisions, so that they, in local matters, generally the island or whatever, they're typically islands, are in control. But when it comes to foreign policy, things like that, the more dominant power takes control. Some examples of protectorates include like the British in Egypt. The British had protectorate status over Egypt for quite a while, and then worked with the Egyptians on the Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. So they had this huge chunk of Africa that they were basically had protection status over. For the French, and you can, I can't get my cursor to go over to the map, but the two countries sort of bordering Angola there, or Algeria there, so Morocco and Tunisia, they were both protectorates of the French after they ceased being full French colonies. All of these were full colonies at one point. But they will later have a protectorate status before they become fully independent. Although a lot of these areas still not only speak their sort of native language, but French is also an official language in many, many of these countries. And for the United States, Cuba. So Cuba actually starts out, it was part of Spain, and then will be, after the Spanish-American War, they will be taken over directly by the Americans, but after about 4 years, the Americans drop back to just having a protectorate status over Cuba. But really, the Americans call the shots, and during this time, American businesses become involved in Cuba, wealthy Americans, and organized crime. Cuba will become a playground for organized crime and gangsters. You can see this in the musical Guys and Dolls, if you are a musical fan. But there was a reason why the mafia was certainly implicated or suspected in the assassination of JFK, because that happened not too long after the Cuban Revolution, where they had been kicked out, and they had hoped that Kennedy would take back over Cuba and allow them to resume their control over the island, and that didn't happen. Not saying that is what happened, but that was certainly speculative. And America had protectorate status in Cuba from 1902 to 1934, and really thereafter until the 50s, just unofficially. Okay, spheres of influence. This is not direct control, so there are really no troops involved here, but these areas are dominated economically and in trade by a powerful country or a group of countries. One of the best examples of spheres of influence at this point is actually in China, which was basically allowed itself to be dominated by various outside countries. Everybody from the British, and you will notice that one of the main British spheres of influence is right next to British India. So that's kind of an obvious one. There's another one, and then the one you can't really see there, it says Hong Kong British, but you don't really see the orange, is Hong Kong. Britain actually signs a lease agreement around this time to control Hong Kong for 99 years. They ultimately surrender Hong Kong in, I want to say, end of 1997, 98 maybe. So yeah, they controlled Hong Kong, brought British government, free speech, all of that to Hong Kong. And now that Hong Kong is back in the hands of China, a lot of that is being cracked down upon. And you can hear about that in the news periodically. Something will pop up. But other countries, the French, the Germans, had a sphere of influence in China. The Japanese, because of their control of Korea, they had a sphere of influence in China. The Russians, and some of, like, there were areas that you can see Manchuria was actually occupied by Russia from 1897 to 1905. So these areas were economically controlled, dominated by the Russians, or by the British, or the French, or whoever. This was a game that the United States was not really involved in at this point, but the United States did have control of the Philippine Islands, which was just south of this. In fact, I think you can see the beginning of the Philippines right next to the thing that says Pacific Ocean, and the other thing that says French Indochina right in the middle there. Also, the British and the Russians in about 1915, so shortly after during World War I, pardon me, they will actually make an agreement between each other to divide up what they called Persia at the time, what is now called Iran, into spheres of influence that each would control. The British had the southern part, the Russians had the northern part. Also, a few years prior to this, the British will actually create the nation of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is not like a historical, oh, this has always been here nation. It was a nation that was created by the British to stop the Russians from being able to get to British India. So Afghanistan was basically a thrown together collection of people that didn't like each other, that for the most part you weren't going to want to walk through, because you would tick off somebody and they would kill you. And that was the whole idea of it. The British put it together not to ever function as an actual country, just to be constantly at war, so nobody wanted to try and walk through it. Sorry, that's a little side tangent, but... And then finally, for the United States, the entire Central America, the entire Caribbean Sea, the Gulf of Mexico, was essentially a bathtub for America, and we dominated that area. Probably the best example of this was during the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt, where America intervened in a lot of different places. Roosevelt very famously said, walk softly or speak softly, depending on who you're hearing the quote from, and carry a big stick. And in this cartoon, you can see, yeah, he has a big stick. But the big stick was not actually a stick. The big stick was what he's pulling behind him, actually, which is the Navy. The American Navy allowed the United States to project way more power than it probably otherwise could have. The same with the British. The British had a mighty Navy. The French Navy was pretty darn good. The Germans are going to start growing their Navy so they can be involved in this stuff. The Russian Navy was really good. The Japanese Navy was really good. The Portuguese had a huge tradition of naval power, etc., etc., etc. These countries that took overseas territories had to have Navy in order to project their power onto another country. Economic imperialism is the next one. Powerful nations or their corporations. So here's where we're getting into stuff that's not even necessarily the government of the country, but it can be the companies of that country that will control nations with weaker economies by owning resources, industries, infrastructure. One of the best examples of this before it becomes an actual colony, India was actually controlled not by the British, but by a British company called the British East India Company. And their influence will grow and grow, beginning in the late 1700s and early 1800s. You can see the kind of salmon-colored territory. That was what the British had in 1805. The more orangey territory was the British by 1838, and the sort of pink, okay, I was seeing two colors there. The sort of pink territory was 1857, and then thereafter you will see dates next to the regions, and that was when the British took them over directly. So it again starts economically, but sort of graduates to full political imperialism as well. The United Fruit Company was an American company that came to dominate a number of Central American and Caribbean nations that could grow, among other things, bananas. Bananas were something that you really could not effectively grow in the United States. We didn't have the climate for it. And bananas were very, very popular amongst people in the United States. If you've ever heard the term Banana Republic, that's where it comes from. It was not first a clothing store where you bought overpriced khaki shorts and Hawaiian shirts and such. No. Banana Republic was a country whose politics and whose economics were dominated not by America, but by the United Fruit Company and other fruit companies. This includes the Dole Corporation in Hawaii, by the way. And one closer to home, the Anaconda Company becomes a huge player. Them and another copper mining company become a huge player in the government of Chile. They control huge amounts of the economy of Chile, and that gives them political power. If you have economic power, you are probably going to gain political power as well. A good example of this might be Elon Musk early in the Trump presidency. Economic power leading to political power. You could also say campaign contributions equaling political power. But in any case, in Chile, the Anaconda Company, again, a Montana company, acquired a massive mine in in the northern part of Chile. Can't pronounce that to save my life. And they had a couple other mines as well. There was another company that controlled a couple mines. And this became a huge share of Anaconda's profits. And in 1922, the company acquired mining operations in Chile, which for a time yielded 2/3 of the company's profits. So yeah, they were making more money in South America, in Chile, than they were in the United States. And that included, I mean, they had the most profitable copper mine in the world in Butte, and they were still making more money in Chile. So very, very interesting. That will last until I think it was about the 70s, when Chile starts to rise up and try and kick the American companies out. And then finally, cultural imperialism. So this, again, not really troops or anything like that. There's no taking territory. This is like new and improved. This is not classic imperialism. This is new imperialism. Great taste, less filling imperialism. Where you're not spreading your guns or anything like that, although I suppose it could involve guns, but it's spreading culture, language, media, values. You are reaching hearts and minds, not necessarily the government of these countries. Okay, but you are still coming to, your culture is dominating their culture. One of the first examples of this that I'm going to share with you is Hawaii. This is a lovely wood carving cut of a Protestant minister or a Protestant missionary from New England preaching under these huge groves in Hawaii. By the way, these groves no longer exist. They were cut down, and in their place, they now plant pineapples and coffee and sugar. Sugar was not a crop that was indigenous to Hawaii. It was brought to Hawaii. And some of the stuff that was indigenous to Hawaii, no longer grown there. In fact, not grown really anywhere, because they could make more money growing sugar and pineapples and coffee and wheat than they could growing their traditional crops, because nobody really liked them except the Hawaiians. But anyway, this, as of 1820, New England missionaries started coming. They were Protestant missionaries. They will be followed by Catholic missionaries. They will be followed by Mormon missionaries. The Mormon mission, not so successful in Hawaii, but eventually a good chunk of Hawaii is converted to some form of Christianity. Now, there are still people that practice more traditional religious teachings in Hawaii. There are people that don't recognize American control over Hawaii. We'll talk about that when we get to when America ultimately took over. And then, of course, the Salish and the Black Robes. This was cultural imperialism. This was, now granted, the Salish invited the Black Robes in, but this was an attempt to convert the native people to Christianity. I ran out of time as I was creating this, but in modern parlance, think about how the popularity of McDonald's, KFC, Burger King, Starbucks, etc., these American corporations. Think about the popularity of Apple computers and Microsoft and all these tech companies, X and all this stuff. Or think about, when you're talking about this kind of imperialism, think about how popular like K-pop is today in the United States and around the world. Think about the popularity of an actually fantastic movie that I was prepared to hate, K-pop Demon Hunters. Fabulous film. I was prepared to absolutely loathe this thing because it sounded stupid, but I will tell you, fabulous movie. Would watch again. So yeah, the sharing of these cultural things back and forth, these are forms of imperialism. Now, a lot of that comes from the United States. A lot of American culture on blue jeans. During the Cold War, you could make serious money if you got a visa to travel to the Soviet Union and you packed extra blue jeans. You could sell them for massive amounts of money on the black market behind the Iron Curtain. In Russia, in the Czech Republic, in Poland, etc. You could sell them for huge amounts of money. American culture was huge. The first time McDonald's went into Russia, it was an absolute revolution. McDonald's no longer in Russia, by the way, because of the invasion of Ukraine. But again, American culture was absolutely huge and has spread around the world. I traveled to Prague in the Czech Republic in the early 2000s, and I was walking in this beautiful old square. It's called Wenceslas Square. It's one of the centers of Prague, and on both sides of the street I was walking down were American stores. At the top of the square is a McDonald's. At the bottom of the square is a McDonald's. There were, I forget the other American companies, and then there were just companies that were obviously styled upon American style. You didn't see traditional Czech clothing and things. These were American style clothing that were being sold. These were American style foodstuffs that were being sold. You could buy pizza. You could buy, I mean, on and on and on. So, you know, from food to culture, the most popular movies around the world are American movies. The most popular music for long periods of time and consistently is American music. Beyonce and the Backstreet Boys and all of these, I'm sure I'm missing more modern examples, but you know, all this stuff goes from the United States and spreads around the world. Sometimes just because it's really popular, but sometimes because it's pushed. So anyway, that's cultural imperialism. So we are going to stop there. So do think about in what parts of the world was imperialism at this time most felt. There were two primary and one sort of secondary example. And then which country had the largest and most widespread empire on the planet? I think we know that one, but do, you know, try and answer that question. But your reflection questions, and that should say number 2, by the way. Reflection question number 2, do you think imperialism is part of our modern world? And how so? I think we've talked about this, but I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think it's as widespread as I laid it out to be? Do you think it's not as big a thing? Talk to me, okay? Tell me in the journal. So we're going to stop there for today. Thank you so much for paying attention. I think we came in at about the half-hour mark, which is fabulous. So hopefully this isn't too long for you. Thanks for paying attention today. I appreciate it. Have a great day. Bye-bye.